As you have probably noticed by now, John's Book of Revelation could be seen as an original version of our modern movie, Star Wars. It depicts the brutality of the Empire's imperial force against the resistance, and the battles are seen among the stars. You saw in the previous video on Revelation chapter 7, that the 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the land holding back the wind, and the angel rising in the east, were John's astronomical dating and geographical references to Antioch, which at that time was the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, and not only served as the military base for Rome's purges against Messianic Jews, but was also ground zero and home of the Nicolaitan movement itself. You saw how the sealing of the 12 tribes of Israel was actually a time frame, which dated the beginning of the Trumpet Judgment 33 years after the death of Titus, in completion of the 6th seal judgment, and looked prophetically into the distant future, toward the ultimate fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, demonstrating the victory of the martyrs of God over the Roman Empire, which had murdered them. This brings us to the present tense into John's time, in Revelation chapter 8 and the Trumpet Judgements. Just as John's use of the symbolism of 7 seals had great significance in biblical texts from the Old Testament, or Septuagint, so too John's use of symbolism of trumpets is also deeply significant. The word trumpets plural occur 49 times in the Old Testament, and it occurs 52 times in the singular for a total of 101 occurrences. If you query the use of the number 7 with the blowing of trumpets, you will find it occurs 8 times, in 4 verses all in one book, and that book is the book of Joshua. And not only is it all found in the book of Joshua, it is all found in reference to one narrative, and that is when the priests were commanded to march around the city of Jericho 7 times, with the Ark of the Covenant, and blow the trumpets 7 times. And God caused the walls of the city to collapse. Archaeologists have discovered Jericho's walls collapsed because of an earthquake and the city was ransacked. When you hear today there is no archaeology to support that claim, what you are hearing is that they have shifted the timeline of when this happened by 100 years, because of the work of new atheism archaeologists in the Middle East such as Israel Finkelstein, whose reconstruction of Middle Eastern chronology, based solely on Egyptian dating alone, in contradiction to everyone else's, from Greek to Hebrew, it shifts the chronological dateline by a few centuries. So rather than connecting the hard facts of archaeology, that they have definitely discovered, to the events described in Hebrew literature and Hebrew chronology which match it despite their 100-year shift from Egypt, they just pretend, and categorically claim to the public, it never happened and there is no evidence. Despite the earlier finds in archaeology from that very location. And this is the basis of the claims you will now hear about Jericho. But it is a rather dubious claim, and its dogmatic denial that anything occurred and there is categorically no evidence, is presumptive Egyptocentric philosophy, not archaeology. A very good documentary entitled, Patterns of Evidence, produced by Tim Mahoney, covers how these claims are made. And it shows the evidence that does exist, despite these academic claims. It is one thing to claim there is evidence we cannot fit into our current timeline, and quite another to make the dishonest exaggerated claim there is no evidence at all, which is what the academics are now doing. That latter is simply a dishonest claim, that clearly undermines their own objective credibility on the subject. Back to the trumpet judgments. Just as you saw John look back to seals mentioned in the Old Testament, in the seal judgment, you see John referring back to the blowing of the trumpets, at Jericho, in the trumpet judgments, and the collapse of its walls and destruction of the city, because of a divinely appointed earthquake, to destroy the city. If you hear a minister teaching Revelation chapter 8 and the trumpet judgment which are blown 7 times, and he does not even bring up Jericho in relation to this text, it is probably more often than not, because you are listening to the propagandizing of a counter-reformationist. Because the association is so obvious and clear, it literally cannot be missed. It is the only section of scripture in the entire Bible that the blowing of trumpets 7 times occurs, and it all occurs in the same set of texts, all referring to Jericho. So the only way you could possibly miss it, would be to do so, intentionally. John's use of the trumpet symbolism however does not stop with Jericho alone. As you have seen already, John is intentionally repeating the patterns of Jewish holidays, and using them in contrast with Rome's sacred holy days, intentionally pointing out their contradictory and conflicting spiritual natures. Partly because, as you have already seen, he is creating a theological argument, against the Nicolaitans, who were Roman assimilationists and who rejected anything Jewish, even down to the commands of Christ to observe the Passover, or recognize his flesh and blood as the Lord's Supper, in the ritual. The word translated as the English word trumpet in the Old Testament, actually referred to a shofar. The reason for this is because shofars were the actual origin of the trumpet. A shofar is just an older version of a trumpet. Later in history, the instrument was made out of brass or metal, and finally after the Middle Ages, the metal trumpet was coiled and made with buttons to shift its airflow. And the term trumpet came to refer to what we know today, and the older forms of the trumpet were designated with other terms. A trumpet with no buttons we now call a bugle. And a trumpet made from an animal's horn, we call it shofar. But John's use of the term was referencing the Old Testament usage, not the modern-day usage we have in English. As we read in the Torah, in Leviticus 23 verses 24 and 25. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, and holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein, but ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. This was actually a reference to shofars, not to modern-day brass trumpets. This is significant for a number of reasons. The first is of course, that it was the shofar which was blown on Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. The same day in which there were 2 goats. One for the atonement of sins for the nation, also called the Yahweh goat. And the other goat marked with ash, and thrown over a cliff, known as the Azazel goat, symbolizing apostasy. Which we have already seen John reference in his previous chapters. The ash mark of apostasy on the Azazel goat is now becoming a major theme in John's writing. The second reason this was significant was because during Rosh Hashanah immediately preceding Yom Kippur, the shofar was blown 30 times. And John opens the Trumpet Judgements in chapter 8 verse 1, with a reference to quote, about half an hour, which is 30 minutes. As you saw, the number 4 became a repeating theme in the seal revelations, as an allusion to the destruction of the Tetrarchy of Judea, and God's vengeance on Rome for all the martyrs killed in its rampages during this event and its aftermath. So too, in the Trumpet Judgements, John will constantly repeat the number 3 and its exponents. And as you will soon see, it is squarely aimed at Roman religious doctrines, which were being assimilated and spread by their government-sponsored Nicolaitan propagandists out of Antioch, in order to eliminate and replace the real apostolic New Testament community with impostors who claimed to be apostolic, but were not. As we have done in the previous videos on the Book of Revelation, we will go through chapter 8 and first establish John's astronomically dated timeline, and then we will go back through and look at events which he describes and match them with the historical timeline to see what he was describing. In chapter 7 you saw that John had already established the date of December 115 AD as the beginning of the Trumpet Judgements, but John is going to add some even more astounding detailed reference points, leading up to that date, in the first verses of chapter 8 on the Trumpet Judgements. As we come to chapter 8, John is taking his readers from the past tense in the seals, to the present and near future tense in the first 4 trumpet judgments. Consequently, he is also transitioning from prophetic commentary on those past events, into prophecies concerning future events into and beyond John's present time. John is repeating the same stylistic prophetic techniques found in Old Testament prophetic literature. He is using time conversion values and astronomical dating like Daniel to mark the time frames for the fulfillment of his prophetic material. But when we come to the first set of futuristic prophecies from John, we discover he is also employing a third stylistic technique. This third technique has been given different descriptive labels by biblical scholars. Some call it progressive fulfillment, others call it dual reference, and some call it cyclical prophecy. We know that it is used here in chapter 8, because in chapter 7, when time-framing the trumpet judgments and the sealing of the 12 tribes of Israel, he produces 2 dates, both of which are significant, but have a fairly long gap between them, thus indicating he is using a dual reference. The second reason we know he is writing a dual reference prophecy, is because he has split the trumpet judgments into 2 different sets. The first 4 trumpet judgments separated by a break in the narrative timeline. One of the reasons many readers today have difficulty understanding Revelation beyond the English translation issues, is also because of a lack of familiarity with the topic of prophecy in the Old Testament. Many specific parts of prophecies in the Old Testament were fulfilled progressively, separated by centuries, in between each part. Even though the original prophetic narrative was separated by only one or two sentences. The first event in the first prophetic sentence may occur in year X. But then the second event may not occur until a century later in year Y. And 2 years later after year Y, the final event occurs in year Z, concluding the completion of the prophecy. The reason this happens is because prophecy is a nonlinear form of thought or consciousness, even if it is recorded or expressed in a linear form in its literature. Some scholars have compared this characteristic in prophetic literature, like viewing two different mountain peaks both lined up, so that only the two peaks are visible. It may look like one mountain with two staggered peaks in the description of the prophet, but the valley between them in time make them clearly visible as two separate distinct, yet related, events. This phenomena is the normative practice in biblical prophecy. A prophecy at the beginning of America might sound like this. Concerning the future of America, I see 4 presidents carved into stone on the side of a mountain, a horseless carriage, and then I see a spaceship that flies to the moon. While a single sentence might describe only 3 events, separated only by commas within the sentence, the 3 events are actually separated by centuries, when they actually occur. These cyclical fulfillments were recognized by Christ in Matthew chapter 24 verse 8, where he refers to the coming abomination of desolation, in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, yet which had actually already occurred once. And he uses the Greek word for birth pains, which come in cycles and growing intensity, until the final event occurs. He was citing the progressive, cyclical, nature of biblical prophecy. And that is the kind of prophecy John will be writing in Revelation chapter 8. When we look at its fulfillment in history, we will see John intentionally using the same kind of progressive, cyclical, stylistic technique that is seen in Old Testament Hebrew prophecy. And he provides this information to his readers by first providing an obvious break in the narrative timeline in the Trumpet Judgements in verse 13, and by giving a dual reference date in the sealing of the 12 tribes. Why is it important to understand John's next set of prophecies are progressive cyclical events? Because it means they can continue to repeat until there is an end to the cycle through a final complete annihilation, or repentance. These are prophecies that are repeating patterns in history, and they have no expiration date on them. That means that these trumpet judgments can continue to occur throughout history, even into our own present day. And as you will see later in the bowl judgments, they will continue to do just that. As you saw in the previous video, John begins his astronomical dating for the trumpet judgments in chapter 8, earlier in chapter 7. Identifying the geographical location of Antioch under the rise of Jupiter and the quadrilinear formation of the 4 stars in Libra directly over Antioch, in the eastern sky. His reference to the winds of Antioch provide further detail to his readers concerning his reference. Now we come to chapter 8 and his prophecy concerning the trumpet judgments, echoing the fall of Jericho in the Old Testament, caused by a divinely appointed earthquake. As you will see in the following chapter, his reference to a cataclysmic earthquake, targeting the city of the Nicolaitans, is also unmistakable in the text. The text of chapter 8 is divided into 2 sections. First, John writes about the signs in the heavens, which confirm to his readers that the prophecy is coming. He does this in verses 1 through 6. Then he describes what happens on the ground during the trumpet judgments, in verses 7 through 13. We will look at 1 through 6 because this section is where he records his astronomical dating. Then we will look at sections 7 through 13 which describe events on the ground which occur afterwards. He begins chapter 8 with a confirmation of his time frame concerning the sealing of the 12 tribes of Israel, which were killed in the destruction of Israel, and the subsequent ethnic cleansing genocides under the Flavian dynasty of Vespasian, Titus and Domitian. Chapter 7 brought us into John's present tense under Domitian, and chapter 8 is going to begin John's transition into prophecies about the near future, echoing his admonition in the beginning of the book that the prophetic timeline was active even as he was writing the book, and as he says, the time is, quote, at hand. Not thousands of years away as counter-reformationists always attempt to claim. You have seen in the previous video, John measured the time frame for the sealing of the martyrs to be 33 years, which was the same age as Christ when he was crucified. Now in chapter 8 verse 1 John repeats that same value as he laid out in chapter 7, by stating there was silence in heaven about a half hour, or about 30 years. In chapter 8 verse 2, he says he sees the 7 angels or 7 stars as he referred to them earlier, being given 7 trumpets, transitioning them from the 7 seals to the next set of prophetic symbols, the trumpets. Then in verse 3 he states the following, quote, "And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer. And there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne." End quote. Here John mentions another angel. In verse 2 he has already cited the 7 stars or planets, and then here he mentions another angel. This angel is not part of the 7, or in other words, the star is not a planet. But he mentions that it comes and stands at the altar, indicating it is an astronomical body which moves in the sky, but is not a planet. As you have also seen earlier, this is how John, and all people in this period of history, referenced meteors, asteroids and comets, all by the use of the term star. He then gives more detail about the star or astronomical body. He says it comes to the altar, or the constellation era. As you have seen previously, this was the constellation era, which is the Latin word for altar. So John is describing an astronomical body which moves across the sky and comes to the constellation era, and we are looking for this astronomical event roughly 30 years from the 6th seal judgment of Mount Vesuvius, which would place this astronomical event between 106 to 110 AD, approximately 10 years after John's writing of the Book of Revelation. The point of mentioning this astronomical movement is that in verse 4 and 5 he states it creates a meteor shower, which marks the occurrence of the trumpet judgments. Quote, "And the smoke of the incense, which came with the prayers of the saints, ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer, and filled it with fire of the altar, and cast it into the earth, and there were voices, and thunderings, and lightnings, and an earthquake." End quote. John says the star comes to the constellation era and fills a cup with fire from the altar and then casts it to the earth, clearly identifying the movement of this astronomical body in front of the constellation era as the cause of a meteor shower which marks the coming of an earthquake. Then in verse 6 he states, quote, "And the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound." End quote. So, when this sign in the heavens is observed, it marks the preparation of the 7 trumpets. Or in other words a preparation period of 7, which serves as a countdown to the final event. And as you have already seen, John's use of numbers prophetically refer to years, meaning 7 years from the observance of this astronomical sign to the event of the 7 trumpets. He has already located the occurrence of the trumpet judgment in the year 115 AD, so if we minus 7 years from the year 115 AD, we should expect to find this astronomical sign sometime around the year 108 AD. This now marks another reference point on John's astronomically dated historical timeline of 108 AD. The English word translated as censer is the Greek word libanos and refers to a cup for burning incense. So we are looking for an astronomical body such as a comet, asteroid or meteor which is the cause of a meteor shower, which will precede a cataclysmic earthquake in Antioch, in December of 115 AD by 7 years, in 108 AD. If we look into the sky around the year 108 AD, we discover there is another amazingly accurate description of astronomical activity in the heavens, once again. But the most amazing thing about this description is that it was truly a revelation. At the time of John's writing in 96 AD, astronomers had no idea what produced meteor showers. It wasn't until the modern era that astronomers realized meteor showers were produced by the debris fields left behind by the orbit of comets and asteroids. Yet here, John clearly connects the movement of an asteroid or a comet with a meteor shower, prior to the coming of the trumpet judgments to the region of Antioch, in the month of December of the year 115 AD. When we look into the heavens watching for a comet or asteroid approaching the constellation era in the year 108 AD, amazingly, we find precisely what John has described, down to the letter of his text. Obviously if this were all just made up, there would be no way on earth that all these descriptions could be so amazingly detailed and accurate. The astronomical data just would not fit either the description or the time frame. But it does, and it does so with absolutely amazing accuracy. In the year 108 AD, the asteroid Phaethon moved directly in front of the constellation Era, precisely as John describes, and precisely when he says it will be there. Phaethon is a remarkable asteroid because it has an irregular sidereal orbit which comes closer to the Sun than any other astronomical body. When it orbits around the Sun, the heat from the Sun breaks off chunks of debris, and this orbit produces the largest meteor shower of the year, in the same month of December, that John is identifying for the Trumpet Judgements. To understand just how amazing this astronomical description is, Phaethon passed near the Earth in 2007 and will not come back again until 2017. After that, Phaethon's irregular orbit will not return near Earth again until 2093. Yet John has described not only the approach of this irregular orbit asteroid correctly in the heavens to the very year, he has done so 1800 years before it was discovered by modern spacecraft satellite deep space imaging, in 1983. And John not only describes its approach but directly connects it to the production of the meteor shower in the year 108 AD, which would serve as a sign of a coming cataclysmic earthquake 7 years later in Antioch in 115 AD. But as amazing as that is, on its own, that is not all John has told us. He mentions two other astronomical events. The first is that there is a cup of incense that is filled which will be poured out on the earth, and he mentions smoke ascending from the hand. There are two more astronomical events preceding the 7 trumpets or shofars. He mentions smoke rising out of the hand of the same angel and a cup which pours out fire onto the land. These two references make his astronomical description utterly unmistakable. After Phaethon is positioned over the constellation Era, in 108 AD, it passes into the hand of Orion on May 18, 110 AD. Why is this so significant and unmistakable? Because in the clear night sky, the Milky Way creates the appearance of smoke in the sky arising from the hand of Orion. And this phenomena is most visible in the month of December, once again. Approaching John's prophesied 7-year mark, later, in September of the year 114 AD, the same asteroid, Phaethon, passes directly over a constellation named Crater. The word crater is literally Latin, for cup, and it is depicted literally as a cup, thus filling the cup with fire. And finally, amazingly, in December of the year 115 AD, the very year and the very month John identified as the Trumpet Judgements, the constellation Crater, the cup, appears turned upside down, as though it were pouring something out, on the eastern horizon directly over skies of Antioch. And John states then, in December 115 AD, when the cup is seen pouring out fire on the horizon, there is a cataclysmic earthquake. And all these astronomically dated signs leading up to that event, confirm the certainty of the prophecy, that it is both accurate, and will definitely happen. Next we will look at the second section of texts, where John describes events on the ground, after his astronomical dating, and we will match them to what we know from history, to see what John had been describing in these ancient texts. Now we come to the actual trumpet judgments in chapter 8 verses 7 through 12. There are only 4 trumpet judgments listed in the 6 verses which follow, and then there is a break in the timeline, as was mentioned earlier. The trumpet judgments are divided into the first 4 which target the city of Antioch, and the subsequent 3 come after the break in the timeline of the narrative, which is given in verse 13. As noted earlier, the trumpet judgments are particularly important because they transition from the past tense in the seal judgment, to the present and near future in John's present tense of his own day. And as you have seen, John has established his timeline with astronomical dating to the date of December 12th. Or 12/12/115 AD, continuing his repetition of the number 12 from chapter 7. As we go through the next 6 verses, you will again recognize some famous apocalyptic symbolism commonly misreferenced in our pop religious culture today, that being the reference to the term wormwood. In pop religious counter-reformation culture, wormwood is applied to everything from the nuclear power plant Chernobyl to Earth-ending asteroids impacting the Earth and ending the world. And as you will soon see, none of which are accurate references to John's use of this term in this text. Because, First, as you have already clearly seen from the Greek, John is not prophesying anything about the whole earth. Teiske refers to the term, the land, not the earth. And secondly, because as you can see as shown on your screen from the Greek interlinear text, John is referencing the name of a star which is known in his own day, because he uses the present tense. And that is a very big deal. You have to follow the shift in Greek tenses very closely in Revelation, otherwise you will completely misread the text. And John switches tenses in the text in his reference to Wormwood. And he does so just in the one statement and then he switches back to the previous tense. That switch in tense is bringing attention to the fact that it is called Wormwood in his own day. Or in other words, it is a known reference to his audience. Obviously, by the use of his own grammar referring to it in the present tense of his own day, it simply grammatically rules out some future unknown asteroid impacting the Earth thousands of years in the future. That scenario may or may not ever happen, but John is making no such reference to it here, in this text, and you can say that with absolute certainty. Because he uses the present tense, and he is discussing events which are going to happen to the city of Antioch in 115 AD and he is referencing a star which his audience already knows the name of as Wormwood. And after you see what is in the Greek language in this text, you will see how utterly ridiculous and scandalous those false claims are. First, let's go through a reconstruction of these texts from the Greek to see what John is actually prophesying, and then look at history to see what occurred in December of 115 AD in Antioch. And just as you saw in the sealed judgment, there are some major translation issues in the text between the Greek text and how it has been translated into English, which will have to be addressed before you can clearly see the simplicity and clarity of what John was really writing to his audience. If you read only the English translation in this text as it is presented to you, you will literally have no clue what John is even discussing. In verse 7, John states, quote, "The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up." End quote. This text is the KJV translation. And once again, you see clearly the use of the term, earth. However, in the original Greek, John wrote no such thing, and once again, you see the correction made in Young's literal translation, where the term, land, is correctly used. That one correction has now completely changed the meaning of this text, from what most people think it is referring to geographically. John states in verse 5, that the trumpet judgments begin with an earthquake. So, what John is about to describe in verses 7 through 12 are all the effects on the land created by a cataclysmic earthquake. In verse 7 he sees hail and fire mixed with blood. The term translated blood is the Greek word, haima, and has a wide application of translations into English. It is another term, like teiske, which has to be read in its linguistic context because the meaning of that term is completely determined by how it is used in the sentence. It can be used to mean anything from grape juice, to literal blood, bleeding out from a wounded body, to a puddle of blood on the ground. It is also consequently, the term used in Greek, to refer to our word bloodshed, not simply a puddle of blood, which is how most Reformation scholars interpreted the use of the word here, since John is describing bloodshed caused by the violence of the earthquake, and a fire. Secondly, the term translated as hail is kalao from the root word, chasma. It is the origin of our word chasm and means to gape or yawn, as in when there is an earthquake, and the earth cracks open, creating a chasm. Earthquakes do not produce hail, but they do produce chasms, in the land. So, you can see, what John has actually written in the Greek, sounds completely different than what we read from our English translators. In Greek, John has said there is an earthquake coming. And when the first angel sounds, he sees chasms in the ground, and a fire, that bring bloodshed. And as a result of this disaster, he sees that fire burning up a third part of the vegetation. Then in verse 8 he states, quote, "And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood." End quote. And once again, we have some major translation issues in this text. The English text is translated as, "a great mountain with fire cast into the sea." But what we find in the Greek text, is lost in the English. The phrase, "oros megaporikeimenon eblethe," is translated as, "a great mountain burning with fire." The Greek word translated as fire, also in the specific sense, means lightning. If we use the specific sense of lightning, rather than fire, the text becomes much more apparent, as it would read, as if a great mountain were struck by lightning. And John refers to this phrase, to illustrate how it was, as if a mountain had been thrown into the sea, as if it had been forcibly catapulted there, by a bolt of lightning. The term fire itself does not capture John's imagery of the force of something slinging a mountain into the sea. But regardless of how you wish to read this text, his entire phrase is simply a metaphor, because he prefaces the comment with the phrase, quote, as it were. End quote. As it were, means it was not, but it is like it had been. Meaning this is a metaphorical description, not a literal event. But the effect of what he is seeing is like this description. So first, let's note John is describing a metaphor, not a literalism. And secondly, he says it in reference to being like a mountain was thrown into the sea. Most modern readers can easily recognize this description as a tsunami. So, the earthquake John is describing is creating a complex of disasters. First there is the earthquake itself in the first trumpet, splitting open the land, and there is a huge fire. Then in the second trumpet there is a tsunami. And he says that the tsunami causes, quote, the third part of the sea to become blood. End quote. Blood here being the same use as before, meaning bloodshed, which he specifies as his intention of his use of the term, in the very next verse, in verse 8 stating, quote, and the third part of the creatures which were in the sea, and had life, died. And the third part of the ships were destroyed. End quote. The destructive force he mentions as destroying ships, would rule out simply a passive change of the water from its normal state, to that being red like blood. And by the way, there is something that does that, and John will reference that phenomena in chapter 16. But here in this text, the sense of the term he is using is bloodshed caused by a destructive force in the sea, and tsunamis are definitely a destructive force that destroys ships. John says that the tsunami he sees kills 1/3 of the marine life and destroys 1/3 of the naval vessels. After this, then comes John's famous quote about Wormwood. Counter-Reformationists will hoop and howl about the truth of John's use of this term. And it is no accident that they will do so. Because John's use of the term wormwood is a direct slam against the Nicolaitans. John is pointing his finger directly at the Nicolaitans of Antioch. So naturally, the theological descendants of the Nicolaitans today, certainly, do not want to tell the public what John was invoking against them, by his use of this term, wormwood. Thus why we have all the populist disinformation cover stories promoted about this reference. First let's read the English text, and then break it down, to see what John was writing about. In verses 10 and 11 John states, quote, and the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters, because they were made bitter. End quote. Here we have another reference to an astronomical event. Now what is odd about counter-reformationists, is that they will deny astronomical dating profusely, which occurs throughout the entire book of Revelation, but suddenly when they get to this verse, it's no longer a bunch of twisted symbolism that they apply to the rest of the book. Here, they openly admit this is a reference to an astronomical event. And it is hard to deny it here, because he openly identifies it as a star. But counter-reformationists take this text as it is in English, and claim therefore this is a huge meteor that is going to crash into the earth and poison 1/3 of all the water supply on the earth. But they make this claim irrationally, ignoring several facts that are written in the text. But before we get to that, let's consider their claim on face value. First, if you claim this refers to the whole world, instead of Antioch as John has already made it quite clear he is referring to, then you are going to have to explain how a meteor manages to, quote, fall on not only the rivers as in all the rivers on 1/3 of the whole earth, but 1/3 of all the aquifers on the earth as well, under the ground. And do so simultaneously over 1/3 of the earth, without destroying the planet in the process. Because you cannot end the world here in verse 11, there are 3 more trumpets which come afterwards. If an asteroid or meteor did manage to break apart and impact the earth so drastically, that it penetrated down to the level of the aquifer over 1/3 of the whole Earth. Most of what the science of geology would tell us, is that you probably have already destroyed the planet and made it uninhabitable for life. So, there would be no 3 trumpets to come, in reality. Secondly, and this is the most important thing as mentioned before, John is not describing an asteroid or meteor thousands of years in the future. He is describing something already known in his own day. How do we know that? Because John states very clearly in verse 11, quote, "And the name of the star is called Wormwood," end quote. Why is the comment so significant? Because he switches tenses. He is describing what he saw in his vision and is using the past tense. When he comes to his comment on Wormwood, he switches tenses. But he does not switch to the future tense. He switches to the present tense. Wormwood is the name of a star known in his own day, and that is why he uses the present tense. Was there a star known as Wormwood in the present tense of John's day? There certainly was, and we will show you that in a minute. But there was in fact a real star known as Wormwood in John's day. And since we now know John was discussing a real star called Wormwood in his own day, how exactly does a star which is several times the size of the Earth, fall to the surface of the Earth and do nothing more than simply pollute some rivers and fountains? No. In fact, if Wormwood fell to Earth as counter-reformationists are claiming, it would disintegrate the entire planet, long before it ever even reached the surface of the Earth. As pointed out earlier, stars rise and fall from and to the Earth, in the astronomical sense of rising and falling on the horizon, and that is precisely how John is using this terminology. So, John sees the star Wormwood, which is known in his own day, fall, and afterwards, the water supply is contaminated. Which is simply another byproduct of a flood, caused by an earthquake-induced tsunami. Water contamination preceded by the fall of the star called Wormwood, on the western horizon. That is what John is referring to. But the reason John brings up Wormwood is a much bigger story and really the key to understanding what he is prophesying against in these 4 trumpet judgments. So, what's the story about this star called Wormwood, that the Counter-Reformation would prefer no one to know about? As you saw earlier, John refers to the star Wormwood, by reminding his readers that the star is called that, in their own day, in the present tense. In other words, his readers know what he is referring to. So, the question is, how do they know this star by the name Wormwood, and what star is he referring to here? And what is he intending to imply to his readers who are aware of the historical background of this reference? The Greek term translated into English as wormwood, is the Greek word, absinthium. Absinthium was a plant in the ancient Mediterranean world. So, what we have here in this reference, is a star which is referred to by the name of a plant. The plant flowers in the winter months from September to December. So, once again, we have a reference to the time frame of December. The actual name of the plant is Artemisia herba alba, named after the Roman mother goddess, Artemis. But that is not all. The Hebrew word for this term is the Hebrew word, la'ana. And in Hebrew it means literally, cursed. The term is used 7 times in the Old Testament. And as pointed out by Wikipedia, it always has the associated meaning of bitterness. So, it was a symbol among Hebrews for bitterness that they applied on a star associated with the Roman mother goddess Artemis. A feminine form of this word, in Hebrew is Mara. And it is found in the book of Ruth chapter 1 verse 20. Quote, "And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me." End quote. So you see in the text in Ruth, that Mara, was a Hebrew name expression for bitterness. So, what does all this have to do with a star? As you saw in the text, John referred to the star not simply as a star but as translated into English, a great star. This comes from the Greek word megas. As shown in the first video on Revelation, the Greek reference to a star constellation by John, was distinguished by his use of the term megas astir, where astir, referred to a single star, the phrase megas astir, referred to a star constellation. So, technically, not only do counter-reformationists have the problem of a single star disintegrating Earth before it ever got here, they have the much bigger problem that John identifies this as a constellation, which he calls in Greek, a megas astir. Not just one star, but an entire constellation. Obviously, the Earth would never survive one star, much less an entire star constellation. What constellation would this have been referring to? Let's review what John has told us so far. First, it is a reference known in John's day. Secondly, it is a reference to an astronomical body known by Jews in particular, because he reminds them of it. Thirdly, it is a constellation that the name of is associated with bitterness. And there is a well-known reference in the Old Testament to the feminine form in Ruth chapter 1 verse 20 spoken of by Naomi called Mara. You can very easily see how the Hebrews would attach the name Mara, meaning bitterness, to a reference to the Roman mother goddess, Artemis, referring to it as cursed. But what star constellation would this Hebrew epitaph, bitterness, or Mara, have been used in reference to in the sky? It turns out that the Middle Eastern name for the constellation Andromeda, which was familiar to and probably used by first-century Jews in the Middle East, was the Arabic name, Al-Mara. Precisely as we see the text in Ruth chapter 1 verse 20. And the term meant the same as we read in the Hebrew, bitterness. Thus, the Megas-Astir, or star constellation, which was familiar to John's readers, was none other than the constellation Andromeda, known by John's readers as Al-Mara, meaning bitterness. And applied by way of association, to the Greek mother goddess, Artemis, for which the wormwood plant was actually named. Al-Mara, or bitterness, was a reference to the constellation Andromeda. And the most amazing thing about this constellation is that if we look at the sky during this time, we find that on December 13th, the Megas-Astir, Al-Mara or Andromeda, is positioned head down on the horizon, literally falling to the earth precisely as John describes, signaling the contamination of the water supply in Antioch. And just in case if you are tempted to think this was not John's precise intended meaning of this text, he adds another astronomically dated detail to it, to make his reference unmistakable. He doesn't just say it is falling to earth, he doesn't just say what it is by name among the Messianic Jewish community he was writing to, he adds another precise detail to make his reference unavoidably clear. He says in verse 10, that this Megas-Astir, or constellation, falls to the horizon, lit up as it were like a lamp. The phrase is translated into English as, burning as it were a lamp. The phrase is kaioumenos os lampos, and literally means lit up like a lamp. There is only one thing in the sky that can light up a constellation like a light burning in a lamp, and that is the moon. And what we see on December 13th 115 AD, precisely as John has described, is the full moon, positioned exactly adjacent to Andromeda, so, it is literally lit up like a lamp. And obviously, there is no way these precisely accurate astronomical matches could exist over and over and over again, if this is not precisely what John intended his own readers to understand given his own instructions to them in chapter 1 verse 20 of the book. If you look at the names of the stars in the constellation Andromeda, they still bear Hebrew and Arabic names to this day. Naturally, a star constellation bearing names of stars from Hebrew and Aramaic would be very familiar to a Jewish audience, as a matter of nationalistic culture. Wormwood is nothing more than the Andromeda constellation falling on the horizon with a full moon on December 13th 115 AD, foreshadowing the coming of water contamination from flooding caused by an earthquake-related tsunami in Antioch. But the question remains, why did John bring this detail up and what was he signifying by it? The curse in the Old Testament of wormwood or bitterness, was a specific curse issued under the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 29 verse 18. Quote, "And ye have seen their abominations, and their idols, which were among them, lest there should be among you man, or woman, or family, or tribe, whose heart turneth away this day from the Lord our God, to go and serve the gods of these nations. Lest there should be among you a root that beareth gall and wormwood. And it come to pass, when he heareth the words of this curse, that he bless himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, though I walk in the imagination of mine heart, to add drunkenness to thirst, the Lord will not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man." End quote. John is invoking a curse from the Torah against apostates who depart from Yahweh and serve the gods of the Gentile empires. Precisely as the Nicolaitans, who called themselves apostles but were not, had done in Antioch. And this is the very reason the Counter-Reformation hides this information about wormwood from the public. Antioch was not a home to Christianity as they claim, it was the base of operations of the Nicolaitans, who replaced the authentic New Testament apostles. And they did so, under the judgment of God, specifically, the Trumpet Judgements, of the Book of Revelation. The Catholic Encyclopedia traces the roots of Roman Catholicism back to Antioch, citing the following remarks. Quote, "Since the city of Antioch was a great center of government and civilization, the Christian religion spread thither almost from the beginning. Nicholas, one of the 7 deacons in Jerusalem, was from Antioch." End quote. They claim their clerical bishops, emanating from Antioch, reached back to the apostolic age, stating, quote, "The first of these bishops, Evodius, reaches back to the apostolic age. At a very early date the Christian community of Antioch became the central point of all the Christian interests in the East. After the fall of Jerusalem, it was the real metropolis of Christianity." End quote. They claim in the same article that by the 4th century, the time of Constantine, it was considered a Christian city. So you see that Roman Catholicism looks to Antioch as its origin, also admitting that that very origin is traced to Nicholas, and its rise to prominence came after Vespasian's destruction of Jerusalem, and the subsequent extermination of the actual New Testament Jewish community. And yet here in the New Testament, in the Book of Revelation, we see no such glowing reviews concerning the events in Antioch. Instead we see John describing a group of religious leaders he does associate with Nicholas, but calling them the Nicolaitans, and as you saw earlier associating them with the coming Antichrist. And here in Revelation, we see John pointing to it as the site of God's trumpet judgments, along with the warning of Wormwood, which is an Old Testament curse on apostate, false prophets. So you can see from a propaganda viewpoint, why the content of the real trumpet judgments must be kept hidden from the public, for the good of the Nicolaitan movement, which today is known as dominant state-sponsored Christianity, or in other words, Roman Catholicism. And not only does the Catholic Encyclopedia itself credit its earliest origins in part to the city of Antioch and even specifically to Saint Nicholas, precisely as John describes the Nicolaitans, condemning them along with the city of Antioch they emerge from. St. Augustine himself praises the very same Flavian dynasty which conducted the extermination program against biblical New Testament Jews. As one Catholic internet blogger put it, quote, "In many respects the first 2 Flavian emperors, Vespasian and Titus, deserve the praise later voiced by St. Augustine, when he called them the most benignant emperors. The good they accorded the Jews extended to the Christians." End quote. How exactly would anyone Christian or Jewish praise a Caesar dynasty that made one of its primary goals to completely exterminate any Jew related to the house of David, which included Christ's own family? And so here, the facade which hides the real identity of the Nicolaitans out of Antioch is exposed. These people were neither Christians nor Jews, they were Nicolaitans, plain and simple. And thus why the yearly veneration of St. Nicholas is always done, in one of their most central religious rituals of the year, the worship of the birth of the sun. The Sol Invictus of the Roman Empire, worshipped under the guise of Christ, which Nicolaitans have done since their beginning in Antioch since apostolic times. And for which, they have been condemned by the real New Testament community, ever since as well. The very term Christian which was reportedly first used in Antioch, was actually an anti-Semitic derogatory term. It is recorded 3 times in the New Testament, but never used as a term that the disciples called themselves. It was a mocking derogatory insult term, and meant, little Christs. Its use in 1 Peter 4:16, clearly connect the use of the term to persecution. It was a nasty term of mockery and derision for Jews, who followed Christ. And it is not by accident that this nasty anti-Semitic derogatory term meaning, little Christs, was first thrown at the New Testament disciples in the city of Antioch. Later, the Nicolaitans appropriated this very term, to abrogate the Jewish identity of the New Testament community, which was at the time of their emergence, still predominantly Jewish, and more importantly still Jewish in their theology as well, as we see recorded in the New Testament in such things as Christ's commandment concerning the Shema still found in Mark chapter 12 verses 28 and 29, and his commandments to keep the Passover meal throughout the 4 Gospel accounts. Now we come to the last of the 4 trumpets before the break in the timeline in verse 13. And John writes, quote, "And the 4th angel sounded, and the 3rd part of the sun was smitten, and the 3rd part of the moon, and the third part of the stars. So, as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. John states that these cataclysms are so intense that they literally block out the sun, moon and stars, but there is a little more to his comment here than that there is simply an obstruction of atmospheric light in the sky. How exactly do you block out 1/3 of the sun? Or 1/3 of the moon? This language is to some extent literal, but there is clearly a symbolic element to these comments because you can't just block out 1/3 of the moon or the sun in the sky. Anything blocking out the sun or the moon would not be precise enough to select only 1/3 of the dot in the sky that you see when looking at the sun and moon. So, what is John talking about here? Just like we saw in examining the phrase in the Greek language referring to 1/4 of the land in the previous videos, John is repeating the same kind of symbolism here in this text. He repeats the number 3 and its exponents throughout these texts over and over again. And here we see it again. He begins with thirds in verse 8 and repeats them throughout the text in every category all the way down into verse 13 where he breaks his timeline and leaves 3 more trumpet judgments for the future. He includes 1/3 of the sea, 1/3 of the trees, 1/3 of the grass, 1/3 of marine life, 1/3 of the ships, 1/3 of the rivers, 1/3 of the fountains, 1/3 of the water, 1/3 of the sun, 1/3 of the moon, and even 1/3 of the stars. Or in other words 1/3 of everything. Now, it is simply common sense that when you read a text like that, there is something symbolical being said. Even if you didn't have knowledge of even a lick of Greek, you would know that there is no way to extinguish 1/3 part of all the stars in outer space, or be so precise with atmospheric obstruction that you extinguish precisely 1/3 of the dot in the sky we see as the sun, or the moon. The problem here once again, is that something very symbolic in this text, is being lost in the English translation, and historical context of John's writing here. What's up with this 1/3 thing? And what is this 1/3 thing that John is so obviously pointing at? As you remember about the repetition of 1/4 during the seal judgment, there was very much a very literal fulfillment. But there was also a very important symbolism in his use of 1/4. So too here in chapter 8 with the trumpet judgments, there is very much a very literal fulfillment of 1/3 being destroyed, but there is also something very symbolic about it as well, which he begins building the case against even earlier in chapter 7, in the sealing of the 12 tribes. John is bringing a prophetic argument against the Nicolaitans, out of Antioch, throughout this entire prophecy. He is demonstrating the wrath of God, against something unique about the Nicolaitans, and their doctrines. But it is something that would be completely lost to a modern reader without an awareness of the historical background and context of these writings. And unfortunately, without this historical background, you will really not understand a word of what John has just written. Precisely as people who have been taught by Counter-Reformationists. As you will see in a minute, John's reference to a destruction of 1/3 has a literal fulfillment. But John is stretching the implication of that destruction far beyond the physical, into the spiritual and theological as well, which is really the whole point of John's prophecy to begin with. When we read this text in English, we do not see what John was pointing out in his language. It is hidden from our view. So, we must peel this layer back and see what is underneath these English translations, to see what we are missing. Since the term 1/3 is used 6 times in just these 13 verses and the number 3 is used once for a total of 7 references, it must be important. So, what is he pointing at here in the number 3? The Greek word which is translated as 1/3 into English, is actually the Greek word, triton. Triton in Greek is more than simply a numerical value. It is literally the name of a Roman god. Triton is the name of the same god, which you saw referenced under the first horse in the seals, in chapter 6. As you can see by viewing the Greek text, the name Triton appears throughout the text. Not simply a third part, but literally a Triton part. And that reference has a much bigger meaning than we see in English. If I say 1/3 of the ships are destroyed, it sounds very different than saying the Triton part of the ships are destroyed. Because destroying Triton's ships may or may not be a literal 1/3. It might be more than 1/3 or it might be less, but it is, whatever part that belongs to Triton. Now if you are tempted to think this is arbitrary innovation and simply made up, then there is another very important historical piece of information you need to know. As you saw in the seal judgment, John uses astronomical dating to point to the Roman goddess Angerona, who was the goddess of Roman secrets and seals, and was on the Roman wax seal for top-secret military documents. John pitted the seals of Yahweh against the seals of Rome's Angerona. Here in the Trumpet Judgements, John is doing precisely the very same thing again. Because in his Trumpet Judgements, he is in the Greek citing the Roman god Triton. Why is that so significant? Tritons plural, the many gods of Triton, were the Roman trumpeteers of the sea. Tritons blew conch shells to calm the seas and to make way for the Roman navy, to give them calm seas when invading foreign countries. The Trumpet Judgements against the Triton part of the land is what John was referencing in the phrase translated into English as a third part. Triton was the father of the Roman triad, or the practices of arranging gods into threes. Every part of nature was ruled by a triad of Roman gods, or a Triton. There were a triad for fountains, rivers and waters. There were a triad for the sun, moon and the stars. There were a triad for land, trees and grass. So, you see, when John mentions these specific categories of nature in threes, and then says a Triton of them was destroyed, he was saying much more to his original audience, than simply one-third. He was saying Triton, the Roman god of trumpeting, was being destroyed. In the God's trumpet judgments upon them. Why was this such a refutation of the Nicolaitans at Antioch? Because as you saw in the earlier videos, John points out, that the doctrine of God, being promoted by the Nicolaitans was simply an assimilation of the Roman triad, and it was a violation of the Shema commanded by God, as he describes it in chapter 16 verse 13 and 14. Quote, "And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils, working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth." As noted earlier, this very doctrine came straight out of the Gospel of the Egyptians, and was described as 3 ogdoads. And ogdoads were depicted in Egypt as frogs precisely as this text describes. The real Trumpet Judgments on the city of Antioch was a refutation of the doctrine of the 3 ogdoads being spread by the apostate Nicolaitans, who were Roman assimilationists sponsored by the Roman government, out of this very same city of Antioch. And that is why the public is never told the truth about the Trumpet Judgments. Verse 13, which is the last verse in chapter 8, is the break in the timeline, referred to in the beginning of our study, where John leaves the present tense and near future, and transitions into the distant future and the coming of the Nicolaitan Antichrist. He shifts his tense now to the future in verse 13 stating, quote, "And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven saying with a loud voice, Woe, 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 to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels, which are yet to sound." End quote. And with that, John ends the section of text we have as chapter 8 in the book of Revelation today. So now we will go back through chapter 8 verses 7 through 12 and compare them to what we know from history. Was there a cataclysmic earthquake and tsunami and fire, on December 13, 115 AD? Remember, if this is all just made up, there would be no way any of this would be accurate to history. So was John's astronomically dated prophecy accurate? Let's see what we find in history. In this video, you've seen that the Trumpet Judgments are targeting the Antichrist Nicolaitans, emerging out of the city of Antioch, under the false guise of the word Christian. You also saw that the term, Wormwood, is a curse from the Old Testament against false prophets, and referred to the constellation, Almara, known today as Andromeda. And you've seen that it does not refer to a future asteroid or comet or any other event thousands of years later, because John refers to it in the present tense. And you've seen that the Trumpet Judgment is a prophecy about a series of natural disasters in Antioch caused by a cataclysmic earthquake and its effects, including a tsunami and water contamination. And you saw that John's repetitive use of the destruction of the phrase, a third part, was actually a reference to Rome's tritons or triads, which were said to rule aspects of nature in threes, and which were the inspiration of the doctrine of God, as taught by the Nicolaitan assimilationists, which John was denouncing and exposing in the book of Revelation. In the next video, we will look into history, to see if these events occurred as John prophesied them. And you will also see one of the greatest secrets, still hidden from the public, by the modern descendants of the Nicolaitans today. You will be amazed at what has occurred in history that has been hidden from the world, in plain view. Don't miss the next video, Antichrist for Dummies, Part 10. Thank you for watching.